I'm Gardner, and I'm an entomologist at UMaine, and today I'm going to talk about some of the research that my lab group has been doing on the socio-ecological dimensions of tick-borne disease risk here in Acadia. So vector-borne disease is one of our most important health problems of the 21st century. Feels like we pretty much can't escape from it in the news. Within the past 20 years, for instance, we've seen the emergence and the spread of mosquito-borne viruses like dengue and chikungunya and Zika. We've also seen the outbreak of West Nile virus and the spread of West Nile in North America. Actually, just within the past month, we saw our first couple positive mosquito pools with West Nile virus in Bangor. So that's liable to become a more significant problem to Maine in the near future. And then, of course, our most important vector-borne disease problem in Maine is tick-borne disease, especially Lyme disease. So Lyme disease has been spreading in Maine since around the 1980s. What we're looking at here is an image of the geographic range expansion of Lyme disease throughout the state, as well as the increase in incidence of human cases in the state since 2001. So you can see in the figure that in the early 2000s, the Lyme disease incidence rate was relatively low and relatively static over time, about 20 cases per 100,000 people per year. But over time, we've seen this really dramatic increase in the number of human cases and also in the geographic range of the human cases, emerging from southern Maine, spreading up coastal Maine in particular. And this range expansion of Lyme disease more or less tracks with the range expansion of its key vector, the black-legged tick. So what we're looking at in this map here is the number of tick submissions by town in Maine to the Maine Medical Center Research Institute that's had a tick identification program offered as a public service since the 1980s. So this map shows the number of tick submissions by town from the early 1990s up to the early 2000s. And then here we're looking at the number of tick submissions in the same towns from 2001 to 2013 over this more recent time scale. And you can see that this distribution of the black-legged tick is very comparable to the distribution of Lyme disease. So even though these submissions likely reflect an increased interest in tick-borne disease, I actually think that they might also represent a real biological phenomenon that the tick vector is spreading, and with it, its associated pathogens. The ecology of the black-legged tick is relatively complex. The tick has a 2-year life cycle with 4 stages. So we've got egg, larva, and nymph, followed by an adult stage with male and female sexes. And in order to molt from one life stage to another, every tick needs to take a blood meal from a vertebrate host. So in the early life stages, the larva and the nymph stages, typically these blood meals are going to come from small mammals, which are close to the ground where they're likely to come into contact with the ticks. And many of these hosts, these small mammal hosts, include the competent reservoirs for Lyme disease and for other tick-borne pathogens. So these small mammal hosts are likely where the ticks are actually becoming infected. And then from there, during the nymph stage and also during the adult stage, the ticks often go on to feed on large mammal hosts. These could include deer, which are important reproductive hosts for the ticks. They also could include dogs or humans and lead to the potential for us to become ill with the pathogen. And so because of this complex ecology of the tick and Lyme disease transmission and how deeply the tick life cycle is embedded in the wildlife community, you can imagine that risk of exposure to tick-borne pathogens is strongly influenced by environmental conditions and also our own land management decisions. So for example, local microclimate conditions have the potential to influence tick survival during the 90% of the life cycle that's spent off host. Abundance of key hosts like small mammals and deer can influence the local abundance of ticks. Also most likely terrestrial vegetation communities, potentially natural predators of ticks as well. in addition, human activities can have a strong impact on the conditions for tick-borne disease transmission. So for example, prescribed burning, harvesting timber, any number of management practices can potentially alter the geographic distribution of the black-legged tick and the persistence and spread of the ticks and the pathogens they transmit in the forest landscape. And so Acadia National Park is a very ideal place to study the impacts of environmental conditions on tick-borne disease dynamics because we have such a wide range of different types of habitats within a relatively small geographical area. It becomes a nice place to make this research problem that's very complex a little more tractable. So the research being conducted in my lab has two main goals. The first goal is to explore the patterns of tick-borne disease risk and the abundance of black-legged ticks in Acadia, as well as the ecological mechanisms that are underlying entomological risk of exposure to tick-borne disease in Acadia. And so this research effort has been led by Sarah and Lucy, my two students, who have both presented earlier today. And what I mean by entomological risk here is simply what is the probability of encountering an infected tick in the landscape. And so a second goal of this project, we've also entered into a collaboration with social scientists at UMaine to try to understand how human behaviors potentially interact with ecological conditions to determine risk of exposure to illness. Because certainly entomological risk is an important element of tick-borne disease exposure risk, but it's not the full story. Many of the same factors that influence the tick life cycle, such as climate change, also tend to have the potential to influence human behavior and the likelihood of humans putting themselves in conditions where they're likely to be exposed to ticks and the pathogens that they transmit. So the goals of our project, broadly posed, are first to document, again, these spatial and temporal patterns of entomological and human behavioral risk of exposure to pathogens, to identify the causal socio-ecological mechanisms that explain this broader landscape of risk. Ultimately, what we're looking to do is begin to forecast future tick-borne disease risk scenarios in light of climate change impacts. And then finally, our end goal and our long-term goal is to develop ecologically safe and sustainable management strategies to inhibit tick-borne disease transmission based on this socio-ecological knowledge that we're accumulating. So I'd like to wrap up by thanking my students and my collaborators who have worked on this project with me, and I look forward to talking further during the panel. Thanks.